In the next few videos, we're going to get ready to record audio, and to do that we need to take a look at our audio device settings and make sure that they're configured correctly for recording and playback. We also use the audio device settings to help us set up a cue mix so that we can hear what we're playing as we're recording. We also need to deal with latency. That's the lag between when you play and when you hear, or when you sing and when you hear back when you're working with a digital audio workstation. There's a few settings that we can use to manage latency as well. So in this video, we're going to look at the audio device settings, and in the next video, we'll look at the song setup to configure the inputs and the outputs to match the audio device that you have selected. So to get to the settings, we go to Studio One Preferences, and that opens the Options dialog box. If you're on a PC, the Studio One menu is over here and Options appears at the bottom of the list. Either way, it opens this exact same dialog box. The third tab over is Audio Device Setup, and the very first setting is the audio device. You can choose from this drop-down from any audio device that you have installed. I'm going to use a PreSonus Fire Studio. It's a Fire Studio project, and I'll be using that for these examples through the recording session. So I'm going to select that right here. Now I'm using a PreSonus brand interface, but Studio One will work with almost any interface available on the market, including the built-in sound on your computer if you'd like to use that. Now the next setting over is Control Panel. On some systems, depending on the driver, this might open additional control panel with buffer settings in there. If you don't have that, then you set the buffer right here. And the device block size is really the buffer setting. This is a really important setting for managing latency in Studio One. If we click here, we can see we have a range of device block sizes from 32 to 248 samples. Now on my system, I can leave it set to 128 and 256 and do almost all my recording and mixing at either of those settings. The thing to keep in mind here, if you're not familiar with this, is if you start to have difficulty with playback, like your performance meter goes kind of really high, or you're getting pops and clicks during playback, you might need to bump this setting up one notch or two in order to get stable playback. If you're mixing a really large project with lots of virtual instruments and effects, you may want to put it up to 512 or 1024, because latency doesn't matter so much when you're mixing. Now there's two scenarios where having low latency matters the most. The most obvious is when you're using virtual instruments or instrument plugins with an external MIDI keyboard. The latency will have an effect on when you play the notes and when you actually hear the note sound. And that's very annoying if there's a long delay there. So there we want low latency. The other example is using a virtual guitar amp or an amp simulator plugin like Ampire that's included with Studio One. There, the effective latency would be the difference between when you play a note on guitar and when you hear it come back out of the speakers or your headphones. Having high latency there would really affect your performance. So you'd want the latency and therefore the device block size to be as low as possible while still getting stable playback. Now the latency is calculated in milliseconds, and it's shown right here. Here's the input latency and here's the output latency. And one thing to keep in mind with latency is 1 millisecond of latency is about the speed of sound through 1 foot of air. So if you have 5 milliseconds of latency, it's sort of like listening to a speaker 5 feet away. Usually that's not too distracting. And the full latency through the system in this scenario with 128 samples is about 10 milliseconds. That's sort of like listening to the speaker from 10 feet away. Now if that's distracting because of that delay, then you can lower this, and you'll see at 64 samples that drops down to 3.7. That's going to give us about 7 milliseconds of latency. So that's how you manage latency in Studio One. I'm going to set this back to 256, which is a kind of a nice average setting. If you're on a PC, there's an additional setting called internal block size, and you can set it differently if you use the lock parameter. I would suggest that you just leave the internal block size locked to the device block size for most purposes. For some diagnostic purposes, you might want to change those settings, but for the most part, you can leave the internal block size locked. Now the next setting here is process precision. I have it set to double 64-bit. We can also set it to single 32-bit. Double 64 gives us the maximum resolution or internal processing, and I would recommend that you leave that set for the most part. The only time you would turn that off is if you're doing some diagnostics because you had some sort of trouble with the system. But I haven't found that setting this to 32-bit or 64-bit has any impact on the performance, so we want to leave this set at the maximum. This process precision does not make Studio One a 64-bit program. That is a difference in how you have it installed. This setting is independent of that, and you can set the setting in the 32-bit or the 64-bit version of Studio One. Now, for the most part, you want to enable multiprocessing. If you have a multi-core computer, which most of us do these days, you can turn off enable multi-core processing for diagnostic reasons. Normally, you'd leave that turned on, and then this lets you turn off some of the CPU cores. So if I turned off a few of these cores, it might give other programs some opportunity to process things in the background or independently of Studio One. For the most part, I would leave these all turned on unless you had some diagnostic reason to do it otherwise. This is input and output latency that we already covered, and we have the sample rate and the bit depth are reported right here. Now, if you're on a Mac, there's one other thing to be aware of. There's an advanced property that is related to latency that you might not be aware of. So let's go to the Advanced tab. First, note that the input latency is currently 8 milliseconds at 256 samples. If I go to the Advanced tab, on the Audio tab, and then down here you'll see Process Audio in Safe Mode. There's a safe mode that has higher latency but potentially more stable playback performance. If I click that, then it goes into a safe mode, and then let me just click Apply here. Back on the audio setup, you'll see that that has a negative impact on latency. The latency goes up quite a bit. From 8, it went up to 13.88. So normally, I would recommend leaving this off unless you have some diagnostic reason or some other compelling reason to turn that on. If your input and output latency are unbalanced on a Mac, then that setting might have something to do with it. So with that said, we've covered everything we need to know about the configuration properties for the audio setup. In the next video, we're going to map our I/O, and we'll use Song Setup for that.